In the remote mountains of Eastern Europe, a young female lieutenant was about to face the most dangerous moment of her military career. What started as a routine training exercise took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a commanding officer determined to break her spirit. Lieutenant Naomi Vega wasn't your typical problem soldier. For 6 years, she had spent her life mastering combat engineering, known for her excessive attention to procedural details and unwavering commitment to competence over compliance. When she encountered Captain Harlan Pike's escalating campaign of intimidation, she had no idea she was walking into a moment that would define not just her career, but the entire culture of Facility Kestrel. Naomi's split-second defensive response, a precise wrist-breaking maneuver executed in front of 180 stunned troops, would lead to consequences that rippled far beyond a single broken bone. What began as institutional bullying designed to silence a whistleblower would become a legend of principled resistance. The forgotten training base would never be the same after one lieutenant proved that true authority comes from respect, not fear, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transport truck's diesel engine growled through the mountain pass like a wounded animal, its exhaust mingling with the thin air at 8,000 feet. Lieutenant Naomi Vega pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window, watching the Eastern European peaks slice through low-hanging clouds with the precision of military engineering. The mountains were beautiful in their stark indifference, snow-dusted granite that had witnessed empires rise and fall, now standing sentinel over what her transfer orders euphemistically called Advanced Combat Training Facility Kestrel. 26 years old, combat engineer, daughter of construction workers who'd taught her that every structure had a weakness if you knew where to look. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being sent to what amounted to professional exile in a place that looked like it had been carved from the bones of old wars. The truck lurched over a pothole, and Naomi's gear shifted beside her. Everything packed with the meticulous care that separated competent soldiers from casualties. Her tools were arranged in order of frequency of use, her weapons maintained to specifications that exceeded regulations, and her personal effects reduced to what could fit in a single duffel bag. Traveling light was a survival skill she'd learned early. In the military, permanence was an illusion. "Facility Kestrel," she murmured, testing the words. The name sounded better than what intelligence briefings had described. A forgotten training base used to warehouse problem officers and underperforming units, the kind of place where careers went to freeze to death in the mountain air. Her reassignment had come with a terse explanation: administrative necessity. Translation: Lieutenant Vega had asked too many inconvenient questions about structural vulnerabilities in forward operating bases, and her previous commanding officer had tired of her excessive thoroughness in safety protocols. Better to send the troublemaker somewhere she couldn't embarrass anyone important. The truck crested a final ridge, and Facility Kestrel spread below them like a military architect's fever dream. Prefabricated buildings clustered around a central compound, surrounded by training fields that looked like scars carved into the mountainside. The whole installation had the temporary feel of something built to last exactly as long as bureaucratic memory, which is to say, not long at all. As they rolled through the main gate, Naomi cataloged details with automatic precision. Guard posts positioned for visibility rather than defensive advantage, communication arrays that looked maintained but not optimized, vehicle maintenance areas that showed signs of chronic understaffing. Everything functional enough to pass inspection, but lacking the edge that separated competent units from exceptional ones. The truck stopped in front of what appeared to be the command building, and Naomi stepped into air so crisp it made her lungs ache. At this altitude, every breath was a reminder that this wasn't a place built for comfort. Captain Harlan Pike was waiting for her. He stood in the doorway of the command building like a recruiting poster that had been left out in the rain too long. 42 years old, according to her briefings, with the kind of bearing that suggested he'd been handsome once and still expected the world to notice. His uniform was immaculate in the way that spoke of too much time spent on appearance and not enough on substance. "Lieutenant Vega," he said, his voice carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for officers who'd never quite lived up to their own expectations. "Welcome to Kestrel. I trust your journey wasn't too challenging." The pause before challenging was deliberate, loaded with implications about her gender, her specialization, her very presence in his domain. Naomi had heard that pause 100 times before, in a dozen different contexts, from men who confused volume with authority. "Sir," she replied, keeping her voice level. "Thank you for the assignment." Pike's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Oh, I think you'll find this assignment very educational. We believe in testing our people here, Lieutenant, finding out what they're really made of."
Generosidade com a comunidade, sua fé inabalável. Ele pintou o retrato de uma mulher que havia vivido com propósito e morreu cercada de amor. Mas ele não conhecera a Teresa que me deslizava dinheiro extra para livros universitários quando Victor não estava olhando. Ele não havia ouvido ela sussurrar, tarde da noite, quando eu tinha 17 anos e medo de nunca ser boa o suficiente: "Mirra, algumas pessoas nascem para seguir e algumas nascem para liderar. Não deixe ninguém convencê-la a ser menor do que você é." Enquanto saíamos da igreja, Sofia finalmente encontrou meus olhos. Seu rosto se desmoronou e, por um momento, vi não a mulher que ficara em silêncio enquanto seu marido me bania, mas a mãe que costumava fazer tranças em meu cabelo e cantar canções de ninar em espanhol quando eu não conseguia dormir. Amanhã, Martin Reyes, o advogado da família, apareceu ao meu lado. 10 horas em meu escritório, a leitura do testamento. Assenti, subitamente ciente de que todos os olhos na vizinhança estavam observando esta troca. "Deve ser interessante", Daniel disse, aparecendo atrás de Martin com o mesmo sorriso frio. A Abuela sempre gostou de suas pequenas surpresas. Enquanto caminhava em direção ao meu carro, podia sentir o peso da atenção de toda a cidade. Amanhã traria respostas para as quais eu não tinha certeza de estar pronta. Mas esta noite eu me lembraria de Teresa, não como a santa que Padre Martinez havia elogiado, mas como a mulher feroz que havia visto algo em mim que valia a pena proteger, mesmo que ela fosse a única que tivesse visto. A chave ainda servia. Estava na varanda da frente da pequena casa de Teresa na rua Maple, minha mão tremendo enquanto girava a familiar chave de latão que ela havia pressionado em minha palma durante minha última visita 3 anos atrás. "Só por precaução, Mirra", ela havia sussurrado então, seus dedos papiráceos apertando os meus. "Esta sempre será a sua casa também." A porta se abriu com o mesmo rangido suave que fazia quando eu tinha 7 anos, entrando escondida depois da escola para ajudar Teresa a dobrar roupas e ouvir as histórias dela. O cheiro me atingiu imediatamente. Velas de baunilha, cera de móveis de limão e algo indefinivelmente caloroso que sempre havia significado segurança para mim. Tudo estava exatamente como eu me lembrava. As mesmas toalhas de crochê nas mesinhas, a mesma coleção de galos de cerâmica no parapeito da cozinha, a mesma fotografia desbotada do meu avô Miguel pendurada acima da lareira. Teresa havia morrido como vivera, sem alarde, sem drama, deixando para trás um espaço que parecia mais um santuário à consistência do que uma casa de luto. Afundei em sua poltrona preferida, o veludo bordô gasto e liso em alguns lugares, e me permiti lembrar. "Você está cometendo um erro, Helena." A voz de Victor ecoou de 5 anos atrás, quando irrompi no escritório do depósito com meu diploma de administração ainda quente da impressora e minha cabeça cheia de ideias sobre modernizar a operação familiar. Eu havia sido tão ingênua, então, pensando que educação e entusiasmo seriam suficientes para conquistar o meu lugar. "O negócio tem funcionado bem há 30 anos sem suas teorias universitárias." Ele havia continuado, sem se incomodar de levantar os olhos para seu livro Razão. Não precisamos de alguma consultora chique nos dizendo como administrar o que construímos. Eu não sou alguma consultora, eu havia retrucado, minha voz mais aguda do que pretendia. Sou sua filha, este é o negócio da minha família também. Foi quando Daniel riu, aquele som cortante que assombrou meus sonhos por anos. Ele estava encostado no batente da porta, braços cruzados, usando a mesma expressão arrogante que havia aperfeiçoado desde a infância. Seu negócio? Helena, você nunca trabalhou um dia na vida. Você foi para colégio com o dinheiro do papai, viveu na sua bolinha enquanto eu estava aqui todos os dias aprendendo como as coisas realmente funcionam, e agora quer entrar e assumir? Eu quero ajudar, eu havia insistido, mas minha voz já estava perdendo força. Ajudar? Victor finalmente levantou os olhos, seus olhos escuros frios. Você quer se ajudar com algo que não conquistou, como sempre. A memória daquele momento ainda fazia meu peito apertar. A maneira como Sofia ficou em silêncio no canto, seus olhos implorando para que eu não piorasse as coisas. A maneira como os trabalhadores do depósito subitamente encontraram tarefas urgentes que requeriam sua atenção imediata. A maneira como me senti encolhendo, ficando menor e menor, até que eu não era nada mais do que uma criança mimada fazendo birra. Acho que você deveria sair, Victor havia dito finalmente. Volte quando tiver aprendido alguma humildade, quando entender o que lealdade significa. Mas eu não havia voltado. Não quando minhas economias acabaram 6 meses depois, não quando dormi no meu carro por 3 noites porque não podia pagar aluguel e comida, não quando finalmente encontrei trabalho estável em uma pequena firma de contabilidade em Cincinnati, trabalhando 70 horas por semana para me provar digna de um salário que mal cobria meus empréstimos universitários. Helena? A voz de Lila me trouxe para o presente. Ela estava parada na porta, segurando 2 xícaras de café da padaria Martinez.
Behind him, other figures emerged from the building. A sergeant with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Sergeant Lena Ortiz, according to Naomi's briefings. 20-year veteran, 2 overseas deployments, reputation for competence that had kept her from being shuffled off to dead-end postings like this one. Her presence suggested that not everyone at Kestrel was here for disciplinary reasons. Near the sergeant stood a young corporal who couldn't have been more than 22, watching the exchange with the kind of attention that marked him as either very smart or very ambitious. Corporal Eli Park, recent graduate of basic engineering training, assigned to Kestrel as his first posting. His expression suggested he was already learning that military reality rarely matched recruiting brochures. Sergeant Ortiz will show you to your quarters, Pike continued. We'll have a unit briefing at 800 tomorrow. I'm sure you're eager to contribute to our mission here. Another loaded pause. Naomi recognized the pattern. Pike was establishing dominance through subtle mockery, testing her reactions, looking for weakness he could exploit later. It was a predictable strategy used by insecure leaders who confused intimidation with respect. I look forward to it, sir, Naomi said. As Pike turned away, Sergeant Ortiz stepped forward. Up close, she was smaller than she'd appeared from a distance, but carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from surviving situations where competence was measured in lives saved rather than forms filed correctly. Her presence suggested that not everyone at Kestrel was here for disciplinary reasons. Come on, Lieutenant, Ortiz said. I'll show you around before the mountain decides to remind us who's really in charge here. As they walked across the compound, Naomi noticed how the other soldiers watched her, some with curiosity, others with the kind of skepticism reserved for outsiders who might upset carefully established hierarchies. A few simply ignored her entirely, the military equivalent of social invisibility. How long have you been at Kestrel, Sergeant? 18 months, Ortiz replied. Long enough to know which buildings leak and which officers actually know what they're doing. The statement hung in the air between them, not quite insubordination, but carrying implications that would have made Pike uncomfortable if he'd heard them. Naomi filed the information away. Ortiz was clearly someone worth knowing, possibly worth trusting. They passed the motor pool, where a dark-skinned soldier was working under the hood of a transport truck. He looked up as they approached, flashing a grin that transformed his whole face. "Fresh meat for the grinder?" he called out cheerfully. "Lieutenant Vega, meet Specialist Rahman, our combat medic and the closest thing we have to an optimist around here." Rahman wiped his hands on a rag and extended one toward Naomi. "Doc Rahman, but everyone just calls me Doc. Word of advice, the coffee here could strip paint, but it'll keep you warm. And if you're looking for the real story about this place, ask Sergeant Ortiz. She's been keeping track of everything that's gone wrong since before I got here." "Everything?" Naomi asked. "Oh, there's a list," Rahman said with mock seriousness. "It's getting pretty long." Sergeant Ortiz shot her a warning look, but there was no real heat in it. Clearly, Rahman served as the unit's pressure valve, using humor to diffuse tensions that might otherwise explode into something more dangerous. They continued the tour, and with each building, each training area, each piece of equipment they passed, Naomi's engineer eye cataloged weaknesses. The base was functional, but barely. Maintenance was reactive rather than preventive. Security protocols were adequate, but unimaginative. Everything suggested a unit that had settled into comfortable mediocrity under leadership that valued compliance over competence. As they reached the quarters that would serve as her temporary home, Naomi realized she was being studied as much as she was studying. Ortiz's questions about her background and training were casual but pointed. Rahman's jokes carried subtle probes about her sense of humor and her tolerance for military absurdity. Even young Corporal Park, when they encountered him near the mess hall, managed to insert questions about his engineering specialization into what appeared to be innocent conversation. They were measuring her, these soldiers, not just her competence, but her character, whether she would fit into their established patterns or disrupt them, whether she would be an ally in whatever quiet rebellions they'd developed against Pike's leadership, or another tool in his efforts to maintain control through intimidation. That night, as Naomi unpacked her gear in the small room that would serve as her temporary home, she reflected on the day's observations. Pike was exactly what she had expected, insecure authority masquerading as strength. But the others were more complex. Ortiz clearly had her own opinions about how the unit should be run. Rahman used humor to mask deeper insights about unit dynamics. Park was young enough to still believe the system could work if only the right people were in charge. And underlying it all was the sense that Facility Kestrel was a place where things simmered just below the surface. Resentments, frustrations, and tensions that Pike's leadership style had created but couldn't resolve. A pressure cooker disguised as a training facility. As she cleaned her sidearm with practiced efficiency, Naomi wondered how long it would take for that pressure to find a way to release itself. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing at 5:30 was redundant. Naomi had been awake for 20 minutes, listening to the mountain wind test the building's structural integrity. Old habits from deployments where sleeping too deeply could mean sleeping permanently. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, her movements economical and precise. The mess hall was nearly empty when she arrived, just a few early risers nursing coffee that looked strong enough to etch metal. Rahman was among them, somehow maintaining his cheerful demeanor despite the hour. "Lieutenant, I strike you as someone who appreciates honesty in their caffeine. Fair warning, this stuff could probably power a generator if we hooked it up right." Naomi poured herself a cup and took a cautious sip. It was indeed brutal, but it was hot and caffeinated, which made it acceptable by military standards. "Thanks for the warning, Doc." "No problem. Figure we all need to look out for each other up here, especially the new arrivals." There was something in his tone that suggested layers beneath the casual friendliness. Naomi had noticed the same thing yesterday. These soldiers communicated in subtext, sharing information through implications rather than direct statements. It was the kind of behavior that developed in units where speaking too directly could have consequences.
At 0800 sharp, Captain Pike called the unit briefing. The room was crowded with faces that ranged from bored to skeptical, with a few showing the kind of resignation that came from too many meetings that achieved nothing but waste time. Pike stood at the front of the room like a man delivering a speech he'd given too many times before. "Today we're conducting equipment readiness assessments," he announced. "Lieutenant Vega, since you're our new engineering specialist, you'll be handling ammunition depot inventory. Sergeant Ortiz has the details." Naomi felt the subtle shift in the room's energy. Ammunition inventory was grunt work. the kind of assignment given to soldiers who needed to be kept busy but out of the way. It was Pike's first move in what she was beginning to recognize as an ongoing campaign to establish her place in his hierarchy. "Yes, sir," she replied. After the briefing, Ortiz approached with a clipboard and an expression that carefully balanced professional courtesy with something that might have been sympathy. "It's pretty straightforward," Ortiz said. "Count everything, check it against the manifest, note any discrepancies. Should take most of the day." "Understood, Sergeant." Ortiz paused, then lowered her voice slightly. "For what it's worth, Lieutenant, everyone gets the inventory assignment when they first arrive. It's traditional." Translation: Pike was hazing her, but it wasn't personal, just the standard operating procedure for putting new arrivals in their place. The information was offered as both warning and reassurance. This too would pass if she could endure it without complaint. The ammunition depot was a converted shipping container, surrounded by concrete barriers and enough warning signs to stock a small museum of military paranoia. Naomi let herself in with the key Ortiz had provided and surveyed her domain for the day. To most soldiers, inventory duty was mind-numbing busy work. Count bullets, check serial numbers, verify quantities against paperwork that had been copied and recopied until any relationship to reality was purely coincidental. But to someone with Naomi's training, an ammunition depot was a library of operational intelligence. Every bullet told a story. Training ammunition versus combat rounds revealed expectations about future deployment. Unusual quantities of specific calibers suggested specialized equipment that might not appear on official manifests. Age and condition of ordnance indicated supply chain efficiency and maintenance protocols. As she worked, Naomi began to construct a mental picture of Facility Kestrel that went far beyond what she'd observed during yesterday's tour. The unit was equipped for standard infantry operations, but with curious gaps. They had plenty of small arms ammunition, but were light on heavy weapons support. Their communication equipment was newer than expected for a training facility, but configured for operations rather than instruction. More interesting were the discrepancies. Items that should have been present according to the manifest, but weren't. Serial numbers that had been altered or were missing entirely. Dates that suggested equipment had been moved recently, but weren't reflected in any of the paperwork she'd been given access to. By noon, she'd identified patterns that suggested Facility Kestrel wasn't quite what it appeared to be. Either the base was conducting operations that weren't reflected in its official mission profile, or someone was very sloppy about record-keeping. Given Pike's apparent competence level, either possibility seemed plausible. She was deep in thought, cross-referencing serial numbers against manufacturer databases she'd memorized during her training when the depot door opened. Corporal Park stepped inside, carrying a requisition form and looking nervous. "Sorry to interrupt, Lieutenant. Captain Pike sent me to pick up training ammunition for this afternoon's drill." Naomi looked at the form, standard request, properly filled out, signed by Pike himself. But the quantities were wrong. Too much ammunition for a standard training exercise, not enough for anything that would require serious firepower. "How many personnel will be participating in the exercise, Corporal?" About 40, ma'am. Standard squad maneuvers." The numbers didn't match. Either Pike was planning something more elaborate than he had indicated, or he didn't understand ammunition requirements for the training he'd ordered. Neither possibility spoke well of his leadership competence. "I'll get this ready for you," Naomi said. As she gathered the requested ammunition, she asked casually, "How long have you been at Kestrel Park?" 6 months, ma'am. It's my first assignment after basic." "What do you think of the training program here?" Park's hesitation was telling. "It's educational, ma'am." Another loaded pause, this one suggesting that Park's education was proceeding in directions not covered by official curricula. Naomi handed him the ammunition case, noting how carefully he avoided making eye contact. The afternoon brought her first direct encounter with Pike's leadership style in action. She was returning from the depot when she heard shouting from the direction of the motor pool. Following the noise, she found Pike berating a mechanic over what appeared to be a routine maintenance issue.
"I don't want to hear excuses, Specialist," Pike was saying. his voice carrying across the compound. "When I say I want these vehicles ready, I mean ready, not almost ready or ready except for minor issues. Ready. Is that concept too complex for you to understand?" The mechanic, a young soldier who couldn't have been more than 20, was standing at attention while Pike continued his tirade. Other soldiers had found reasons to be nearby, drawn by the spectacle but careful not to appear too interested. Naomi watched the scene with professional detachment. Pike's anger seemed disproportionate to the problem, a delay in routine maintenance that any competent officer would have anticipated and planned around. But more telling was the audience. These soldiers weren't witnessing discipline, they were watching theater designed to remind them of Pike's authority. When Pike finally dismissed the mechanic, who hurried away with obvious relief, his gaze fell on Naomi. For a moment, their eyes met across the motor pool, and she saw something that might have been calculation in his expression. "Lieutenant Vega, how's our inventory coming along?" "Nearly complete, sir. I should have the final report ready by end of day." "Excellent. I'm sure it will be thorough." Again, that loaded pause. Pike was marking her, letting her know that he was aware of her presence, her activities, her potential for disruption. It was a warning disguised as casual conversation, delivered in front of witnesses who would remember and repeat it. That evening, as Naomi compiled her inventory report, she faced a decision that would define her future relationship with Pike and the unit. The discrepancies she discovered could be reported as simple clerical errors, easily explained and quickly corrected, or they could be documented fully with all their implications for operational security and command competence. A smart officer, one who valued career advancement over principle, would choose discretion. Note the obvious problems, ignore the subtle ones, and submit a report that wouldn't embarrass anyone important. But Naomi had been sent to Kestrel precisely because she wasn't that kind of smart. She typed carefully, documenting every discrepancy, every anomaly, every question that her day's work had raised. The report was professional, factual, and devastating in its implications. Anyone reading it would understand that either Pike's command was incompetent or something was happening at Facility Kestrel that didn't match its official mission. As she sealed the report in an envelope addressed to Pike, Naomi reflected on the choice she was making. This wasn't just about ammunition inventory or clerical accuracy. This was about whether she would accept the role Pike had assigned her, decorative officer who could be safely ignored, or force him to acknowledge her as something more dangerous, a competent soldier who couldn't be dismissed or controlled. The morning briefing 2 days later had the electric feeling of a storm front moving through the mountains. Pike stood at the front of the room with Naomi's inventory report in his hands and an expression that suggested he'd found something distasteful under his boot. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the kind of forced casualness that preceded verbal ambushes, "it seems our new engineering specialist has some concerns about our operational readiness." Naomi felt the attention of 43 soldiers focus on her like a heat-seeking missile finding its target. She kept her expression neutral, hands folded in her lap, waiting to see how Pike would play this. "According to Lieutenant Vega's very detailed report," Pike emphasized very detailed as if accuracy was a character flaw, "we have significant discrepancies in our ammunition accountability. Apparently, our record-keeping doesn't meet her exacting standards." Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably. These were people who'd lived with the base's casual approach to paperwork for months, accepting it as part of Kestrel's institutional culture. Naomi's report was implicitly criticizing not just Pike's leadership, but their collective tolerance for corner-cutting. "Now, I want to be clear," Pike said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone about to say something completely unreasonable. "I appreciate thoroughness. I really do. But there's a difference between healthy attention to detail and—" he paused, looking directly at Naomi, "obsessive nitpicking that wastes everyone's time."
The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. If Naomi protested, she would appear defensive and prove his point about oversensitivity. If she remained silent, she would accept his characterization of her competence. "Sir," Naomi said, her voice calm and professional, "the report documents standard accountability procedures. If there are specific concerns about the findings, I'd be happy to review them privately." It was a perfect response, acknowledging his authority while subtly suggesting that his public criticism was improper. But Pike wasn't interested in reasonable discussion. He was interested in dominance. "Oh, I think the whole unit should hear this. After all, we're all responsible for operational readiness here. Sergeant Ortiz, you've been managing supply accountability for 18 months. Do you think we have a crisis that requires this level of intervention?"
Ortiz was trapped between loyalty to Pike and respect for competence. Her answer would define not just her relationship with Naomi, but her standing within the unit's power structure. "Sir," Ortiz said carefully, "Lieutenant Vega's report identifies some areas where we could improve our procedures. That seems useful." It was diplomatic language that managed to support Naomi without directly challenging Pike. But Pike was past the point where diplomacy would satisfy him. "Areas where we could improve," Pike repeated. "Is that what we're calling it?" He turned to address the room directly. "How many of you think our current supply system is so broken that it requires complete overhaul by someone who's been here less than a week?" Silence filled the room like toxic gas. These soldiers understood that they were being asked to choose sides in a conflict that had implications far beyond ammunition inventory. Supporting Naomi meant implicitly criticizing Pike's leadership. Supporting Pike meant dismissing legitimate concerns about operational readiness. Corporal Park raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, I read the report. Some of those discrepancies could affect mission readiness if they're not addressed." Pike's smile became sharp enough to cut glass. "Thank you, Corporal Park. It's always interesting to hear from our junior personnel about complex command decisions." The dismissal was brutal in its casual cruelty. Park's face reddened, but he didn't respond. He'd learned the same lesson every soldier at Kestrel eventually learned. Pike's ego was more fragile than base security, and challenging it came with consequences. "Let me be clear about something," Pike continued, his voice rising slightly. "This unit has been functioning effectively for months. We've met every training requirement, passed every inspection, and maintained operational readiness according to established standards. I won't have that record undermined by someone who thinks she can waltz in here and find fault with everything we've built." The pronoun was telling. Not "we've built," but "I've built." Pike saw the unit as an extension of his own ego, and criticism of its procedures as a personal attack. Doc Raymond cleared his throat. "Sir, if there are safety issues—" "There are no safety issues, Specialist," Pike cut him off. "There are procedural differences of opinion, and in this unit, my opinion carries the weight of command authority." The room had gone completely silent now. These soldiers were witnessing something that went beyond normal command dynamics. Pike was making it clear that dissent would not be tolerated, that questioning his decisions was equivalent to insubordination. Naomi realized she was at a crossroads. She could accept Pike's characterization, apologize for overstepping, and settle into the role of decorative officer who kept her mouth shut and her opinions to herself. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice for someone who wanted to survive this assignment with her record intact. Or she could fight. "Sir," Naomi said, standing up slowly, "I believe there may be a misunderstanding about the report's intent." Pike's eyes glittered with something that might have been triumph. She was giving him exactly what he wanted, an opportunity to put her in her place in front of the entire unit. "Please, Lieutenant," he said with mock courtesy, "enlighten us." The report documents factual discrepancies between inventory records and actual stores. Those discrepancies exist regardless of anyone's opinion about their significance. The question isn't whether they should be ignored, but how they should be addressed.
It was a careful response, focusing on facts rather than interpretations. But Pike was past the point where facts mattered. How they should be addressed, I see. And I suppose you have recommendations for how I should run my unit? The question was loaded with enough explosive potential to level the building. Pike was daring her to challenge his authority directly, betting that she wouldn't have the courage to follow her convictions to their logical conclusion. Naomi looked around the room, meeting the eyes of soldiers who were watching this confrontation with the fascination of people witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Ortiz looked concerned. Rahman appeared thoughtful. Park was clearly worried about where this was heading. These were good soldiers trapped in a bad situation, led by an officer who confused authority with competence. They deserved better. More importantly, if Kestrel ever faced real combat, they would need better. "Sir," Naomi said, her voice steady and clear, "I recommend that we address the discrepancies systematically, implement standard accountability procedures, and ensure that our operational readiness matches our reporting. Because if we're ever called upon to perform our mission under combat conditions, our soldiers' lives may depend on the accuracy of our records." The room erupted in tension so thick it was almost visible. Pike's face had gone through several interesting color changes, finally settling on a shade that suggested dangerously elevated blood pressure. "How dare you," he said, his voice barely controlled. "How dare you suggest that this unit's readiness is compromised? How dare you imply that I don't care about my soldiers' lives?" "Sir, I didn't. You absolutely did." Pike stepped closer to her, using his height advantage to loom over her in a classic intimidation move. "You've been here 3 days, Lieutenant, 3 days, and you think you can lecture me about military readiness? You think you can question procedures that have been working since before you arrived?" Naomi held her ground, neither backing down nor escalating. "Sir, I think accurate record-keeping is fundamental to unit effectiveness." "Unit effectiveness?" Pike's laugh was ugly. "Let me tell you about unit effectiveness, Lieutenant. It's about soldiers who follow orders without questioning every detail. It's about officers who understand their place in the chain of command. It's about loyalty to the team instead of grandstanding for personal advancement." Each accusation hit like a verbal slap, designed to provoke an emotional response that would justify whatever Pike planned to do next. Naomi recognized the technique: escalation through provocation, creating a crisis that would allow him to impose his will through disciplinary action. But she'd been dealing with bullies in uniform long enough to know how this game was played. "I understand, sir," she said quietly. The words seemed to deflate Pike's momentum. He'd been building toward a climactic confrontation, and her refusal to take the bait left him with nowhere to go. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then, he smiled, and Naomi realized she'd made a tactical error. By appearing to submit, she'd given him exactly what he wanted: public acknowledgement of his dominance, the victory he'd been seeking since she'd arrived. "Good," Pike said, his voice now carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully established his authority. "I'm glad we understand each other. Now I think it's time we moved past this misunderstanding and focused on what really matters: unit cohesion, mutual trust, working together toward common goals." He looked around the room, making eye contact with key personnel to ensure they understood the lesson being delivered. Because that's what makes a unit effective: not paperwork, not obsessive attention to minor discrepancies. Leadership, confidence, the courage to make decisions without second-guessing every detail. It was a masterful performance, transforming his petty authoritarianism into principled leadership through the simple expedient of claiming moral high ground. The soldiers in the room were nodding along, either convinced by his rhetoric or smart enough to appear convinced. But Naomi saw something else in their faces: the subtle discomfort of people who'd witnessed something that didn't quite match the official narrative, the quiet skepticism of soldiers who'd learned to recognize the difference between leadership and theater. Pike had won this round, but the victory was less complete than he imagined, and more importantly, he'd revealed something about himself that couldn't be taken back.
He was afraid of her. Not physically, though Naomi's military training made that a possibility worth considering. He was afraid of what she represented. Competence that couldn't be controlled, standards that couldn't be lowered, questions that couldn't be dismissed. As the briefing ended and soldiers filed out of the room, Naomi remained seated, thinking about what had just happened. Pike had established his dominance, but he'd also shown his hand. This wasn't about military efficiency or unit cohesion. This was about ego and control. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet voice was whispering that this confrontation was just the beginning. 3 days after the briefing room confrontation, Pike announced a full-scale combat readiness exercise, the kind of elaborate demonstration that consumed resources, disrupted schedules, and served no purpose beyond spectacle. But this wasn't about training. This was about theater. All personnel, formation at 0600 hours, Pike declared during the morning briefing, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone selling a product he didn't believe in. We're going to show what Facility Kestrel can do when we work as a unified team. Naomi felt the shift in energy around her. Conversations that had been flowing naturally suddenly became stilted. Glances that had been casual became calculating. Word had spread through the unit with the efficiency of a computer virus. Pike was planning something, and Lieutenant Vega was the target. After the briefing, Sergeant Ortiz appeared at Naomi's elbow with the casual stealth that marked professional non-commissioned officers. "Lieutenant, he's going to make an example of you," Ortiz said quietly. "Tomorrow's exercise isn't about unit readiness. It's about putting you in your place in front of 180 troops." I suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made my stomach tighten. What kind of example? The kind where you're set up to fail publicly, where your competence gets twisted into incompetence through impossible scenarios and rigged outcomes. Ortiz's expression was grim. I've seen him do it before, usually to junior officers who ask too many questions or NCOs who challenge his authority. What happened to them? Transfers, disciplinary actions, careers that never recovered from the reputation damage. Ortiz studied Naomi's face. "The thing is, Lieutenant, most of them deserved what they got. They were genuinely incompetent or genuinely insubordinate. But you're neither." It was the closest thing to a compliment Ortiz had offered, and coming from a 20-year veteran, it carried weight. "Any advice, Sergeant?" Ortiz was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words. "Don't give him what he wants. Don't lose your temper, don't make excuses, and don't try to explain why his scenario is unfair. Just be yourself. Do your job. Let your competence speak for itself. And if that's not enough, then we'll deal with the consequences. But Lieutenant, I've got a feeling you're tougher than Pike thinks you are." That evening, as Naomi cleaned her gear with methodical precision, she reflected on the situation she'd walked into. Pike wasn't just trying to humiliate her, he was trying to break her, to transform her from a potential threat into a cautionary tale that would discourage future challenges to his authority. The smart play would be to fail gracefully, accept the humiliation, learn the lesson, and settle into the role of decorative officer who knew her place. It would preserve her career and maintain unit stability. But Naomi had never been particularly smart about accepting injustice. The morning air bit through combat uniforms as 180 soldiers formed up on the main training field. Their breath created small clouds in the mountain cold, and the only sounds were boot steps on frozen ground and the distant hum of generators powering the observation equipment Pike had arranged. Naomi stood in the front rank, positioned where every soldier could see her clearly. Pike had orchestrated the formation with theatrical precision. She was simultaneously the center of attention and completely isolated. "Today's exercise will test our ability to respond to complex tactical scenarios under pressure," Pike announced, his voice carrying across the field with practiced authority. "We'll be evaluating leadership decision-making, unit cohesion, and individual performance under stress." He turned to look directly at Naomi. "Lieutenant Vega will be commanding the assault element. Her mission is to secure the communications facility while maintaining unit integrity and minimizing casualties."
On the surface, it sounded like a standard leadership exercise, but Naomi immediately recognized the trap. The scenario was designed to be impossible. Too many objectives, insufficient resources, conflicting priorities that would force her to choose between mission success and soldier safety. Pike had positioned her to fail, then positioned the entire unit to witness that failure. The exercise began with scripted precision. Naomi's assault element consisted of 12 soldiers armed with training weapons and limited ammunition. Their objective was a fortified position defended by superior numbers with unlimited resources. But as the scenario developed, Pike began improvising, adding complications that weren't in the original briefing, changing rules that had been established during the planning phase, creating a fluid situation where success became increasingly impossible. Naomi adapted, using her engineering background to identify alternative approaches that Pike's scenario hadn't anticipated. When direct assault proved futile, she repositioned her element to exploit weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. When ammunition ran low, she coordinated with supporting elements to maximize efficiency. For 20 minutes, she turned Pike's rigged scenario into a demonstration of tactical creativity and adaptive leadership. The watching soldiers began murmuring appreciation for maneuvers they hadn't expected to see from the problematic lieutenant. Pike's frustration was visible from across the field. "Hold position," he called out, jogging toward Naomi's element with the kind of aggressive body language that suggested the exercise was about to become something else entirely. "Lieutenant Vega," Pike said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, "your tactical approach is completely inappropriate for this scenario. You're endangering your troops with reckless improvisation." It was a public dressing down delivered for maximum impact, the kind of humiliation designed to destroy an officer's credibility in front of their soldiers. "Sir, I understand," Naomi replied calmly. But Pike was past the point where professional courtesy would satisfy him. The exercise had become a referendum on his authority, and Naomi's competence was making him look weak in front of his command. "I don't think you do understand," Pike said, stepping closer. "I think you believe you're smarter than everyone else. I think you believe the rules don't apply to you." He reached out and grabbed her equipment harness, yanking her toward him with the kind of physical dominance that was designed to humiliate and control. "Let me explain something to you, Lieutenant." The movement was instinctive, trained into her through years of combat preparation and personal experience with men who confused physical intimidation with leadership. Naomi's left hand moved in a precise arc, catching Pike's wrist and applying pressure to nerve points that most people didn't know existed. The sound of breaking bone carried clearly across the silent training field. Pike screamed, a sound that was part pain, part shock, and part recognition that everything had just changed. He dropped to one knee, cradling his shattered wrist against his chest, his face pale with pain and humiliation. 180 soldiers stared in absolute silence. Then the murmurs began, whispered conversations that spread through the formation like wildfire, carrying news of what they'd just witnessed across the compound and into legend. Sergeant Ortiz stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes showing something that might have been satisfaction. "Sir, perhaps we should get you to the medical facility." Doc Rahman's makeshift medical station in the converted supply closet became the epicenter of Facility Kestrel's transformation. Pike sat on an examination table, his wrist encased in an improvised splint, while Rahman worked with the professional detachment that marked military medics dealing with command-related injuries.
Clean break, Rahman reported to no one in particular. Radius and ulna. Gonna need proper orthopedic treatment, which means a trip down the mountain to the real hospital. Pike's face had gone through several interesting color changes during the examination, finally settling on a shade that suggested both physical pain and psychological trauma. The man who'd been projecting authority just an hour earlier now looked small and diminished, cradling his injury like a wounded animal. "This is assault," Pike said, his voice tight with pain and fury. "Unprovoked assault on a superior officer. I want charges filed immediately." Rahman carefully avoided making eye contact with anyone as he continued his examination.
Well, sir, that's above my pay grade. I just fix what's broken. Outside the medical station, the base had divided into factions with the efficiency of a cellular organism reproducing. Conversations happened in clusters, voices lowered but energy elevated, as soldiers processed what they'd witnessed and chose sides in a conflict that had just become unavoidable. Near the motor pool, Corporal Park was holding court with a group of younger soldiers, his voice animated as he described the moment of impact. "You should have seen it," he was saying, completely calm, completely controlled. Pike grabbed her and she just neutralized the threat, like something out of a training manual. "But she broke his wrist," one of the privates said. "That's got to be career suicide." "Maybe," Park replied, "but did you see his face when it happened? That wasn't just pain, that was recognition. He finally understood that she's not someone you can push around." At the communications building, a different group was having a different conversation. These were Pike's loyalists, soldiers who'd benefited from his favor and now faced an uncertain future. "She's dangerous, unstable. You don't break your commanding officer's wrist over a training disagreement." "Pike was just trying to get her attention," another added. "Make a point about following orders." She completely overreacted. But even among Pike's supporters, doubt was creeping in. They'd all witnessed the exercise, seen Pike's escalating frustration, observed the moment when professional disagreement had become personal confrontation. Sergeant Ortiz found Naomi in her quarters, sitting on her narrow bunk and methodically cleaning her sidearm with movements that suggested meditation rather than maintenance. "How are you holding up, Lieutenant?" Naomi looked up from her weapon. "I've been better, Sergeant. I assume there will be consequences." "Oh, there will be consequences," Ortiz agreed. "Question is, what kind and for who?" She sat down on the chair that served as the room's only furniture other than the bunk. "What happened out there, Pike crossed a line. Physical contact during a disagreement isn't standard operating procedure, but breaking your commanding officer's wrist isn't either." "I know." "The thing is," Ortiz continued, "most of the troops saw what really happened. Pike grabbed you first, you defended yourself. That's going to matter when the investigation starts." "Investigation?" "Colonel Hayes is already en route. Word travels fast when officers start breaking each other's bones. She'll want to understand exactly what happened and why." Naomi resumed cleaning her weapon, the familiar routine providing stability in an increasingly unstable situation. "What do you know about Colonel Hayes?" "Career officer, combat veteran, reputation for fairness, but zero tolerance for incompetence. She's also one of the few women to reach that rank in her generation, which means she's probably faced her share of Captain Pikes." It was useful intelligence, but it didn't change the fundamental equation. Naomi had broken her commanding officer's wrist in front of 180 witnesses. No matter how justified her actions might have been, that kind of defiance carried consequences that could destroy careers. "Sergeant," Naomi said quietly, "what would you have done in that situation?" Ortiz was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Honestly, probably the same thing. Pike was out of line, and someone needed to remind him that authority has limits." She stood up, smoothing her uniform with automatic precision. "But I also know that doing the right thing doesn't always protect you from the consequences." As evening fell over Facility Kestrel, the base's transformation continued. Soldiers who'd never questioned Pike's leadership were suddenly reevaluating months of decisions and policies. Officers who'd accepted his authority without challenge were quietly discussing alternatives. And in the medical station, Pike continued nursing his broken wrist and his shattered reputation, planning whatever revenge a humiliated commander might devise against the lieutenant who had dared to fight back.
Naomi watched through her quarters window as Hayes strode across the compound, flanked by 2 aides and trailed by a wake of nervous energy from every soldier who crossed her path. This was what real authority looked like, quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself through intimidation. The colonel's first stop was the medical station, where Pike was still nursing his injury and his wounded pride. Through the thin walls, Naomi could hear muffled voices but couldn't make out specific words. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and ended with Pike's evacuation to the base hospital for proper orthopedic treatment. His departure felt like the removal of a splinter from the unit's collective psyche. Hayes established her command post in Pike's former office, transforming the space from a shrine to ego into a functional workspace within an hour. Her first official act was to request individual interviews with key personnel, starting with Sergeant Ortiz and working systematically through the chain of command. When Naomi's turn came, she found herself facing an officer who radiated the kind of competence she'd spent her career aspiring to achieve. "Lieutenant Vega," Hayes said, gesturing to a chair across from Pike's former desk. "Please, sit. I understand you've had an eventful few days." "Yes, ma'am." Hayes opened a file that appeared to contain Naomi's complete service record. "Engineering specialist, top 10% of your class, commendations for innovation and problem solving. Also noted for what your previous commanding officer called excessive attention to procedural details." It was a diplomatic way of describing the personality conflicts that had led her assignment at Kestrel. Naomi remained silent, waiting to see where Hayes was leading. "Tell me about yesterday's incident," Hayes said. "Your perspective, your understanding of what happened and why." Naomi had rehearsed this moment, but Hayes's direct approach made prepared statements feel inadequate. Instead, she spoke from memory, describing the exercise setup, Pike's escalating frustration, and the moment when professional disagreement had become physical confrontation. "Captain Pike grabbed my equipment harness. I responded with defensive measures appropriate to the threat level." "Defensive measures," Hayes repeated. "That's an interesting way to describe breaking your commanding officer's wrist." "Ma'am, I was trained to respond to physical aggression with sufficient force to neutralize the threat while minimizing collateral damage. The technique I used was precise and controlled." Hayes made a note in her file. "You are also trained to respect the chain of command and follow lawful orders. How do you reconcile those two imperatives?" It was the question Naomi had been dreading, the one that forced her to choose between admission of guilt and justification of defiance. "Ma'am, I believe Captain Pike's actions exceeded the bounds of lawful command authority. Physical intimidation isn't an acceptable leadership technique." "And you felt qualified to make that determination in the moment?" "I felt qualified to defend myself when grabbed by someone attempting to use physical force to resolve a professional disagreement." Hayes closed the file and studied Naomi with the kind of assessment that felt like being evaluated by sophisticated equipment. "Lieutenant, I've been in command positions for 15 years. I've dealt with insubordinate officers, incompetent leaders, and situations where the line between legitimate authority and abuse of power became blurred. What happened yesterday was unusual, but not unprecedented." Naomi waited, understanding that Hayes was building towards something important. "The question I'm facing," Hayes continued, "is whether you're a problem officer who can't accept authority or a competent soldier who was placed in an impossible situation by inadequate leadership." "Ma'am, I believe my record speaks to my willingness to follow competent leadership and execute lawful orders." "Your record is exactly why I'm here, Lieutenant, because officers with your qualifications usually don't end up at places like Kestrel unless someone made a mistake." Hayes stood up, signaling the end of the interview. "I'll be conducting a full readiness evaluation over the next 48 hours. Consider it an opportunity to demonstrate your actual capabilities under proper leadership." As Naomi left the office, she realized that Hayes had just offered her something Pike never had, a fair chance to prove her worth based on competence rather than politics. But she also understood that this evaluation would determine not just her future, but the future of every soldier at Facility Kestrel who'd been trapped under Pike's leadership. The stakes had just gotten considerably higher. Colonel Hayes's evaluation began at 0500 hours with the kind of surprise that separated competent units from competent paperwork.
No advance warning, no preparation time, just the harsh buzz of the alert klaxon cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through institutional complacency. All personnel, full combat gear, assembly area in 15 minutes. This is not a drill. Hayes's voice crackled through the base communication system. Naomi was dressed and moving before her conscious mind fully processed the announcement. Muscle memory and training kicked in, her hands moving through the familiar sequence of combat preparation while her brain cataloged the implications of Hayes's timing and approach.
The assembly area was chaos, managed by experience. 178 soldiers, Pike's evacuation had reduced their numbers, formed up in the kind of organized confusion that marked units adapting to unexpected leadership transitions. Some moved with the fluid efficiency of veterans, others with the nervous energy of soldiers unsure what was expected of them. Hayes stood at the front of the formation, her uniform immaculate despite the early hour, flanked by her aides and a collection of equipment that suggested this evaluation would involve more than paperwork review. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Today we're going to find out what Facility Kestrel can actually do when tested under realistic conditions." She gestured toward the mountainous terrain that surrounded the base. "Intelligence indicates hostile forces have established an observation post approximately 2 kilometers northeast of our position. Your mission is to locate and neutralize this threat while maintaining operational security and unit cohesion." It was the kind of scenario that looked simple on paper but became complex in execution. Real terrain, realistic timelines, genuine consequences for failure. The kind of test that revealed competence levels with surgical precision. Acting command structure will be determined by demonstrated competence during the operation. Leadership positions will be earned, not inherited. The message was clear. This wasn't about rank or seniority. This was about who could actually lead soldiers under pressure. Hayes turned to Naomi. "Lieutenant Vega, you'll be responsible for assault element planning and execution. Use whatever resources you require." It was an opportunity disguised as an assignment. Hayes was giving Naomi the chance to demonstrate her capabilities under conditions that would reveal both her strengths and limitations. Naomi accepted the responsibility with the calm professionalism that had become her trademark. "Yes, ma'am. What's our operational timeline?" 30 minutes for planning, 2 hours for execution. Failure to neutralize the threat will result in simulated casualties for the entire unit. As the formation dispersed to prepare equipment and review intelligence, Naomi found herself surrounded by soldiers who'd witnessed her confrontation with Pike and were now watching to see what she'd do with actual authority. Sergeant Ortiz appeared at her shoulder with the automatic efficiency of experienced non-commissioning officers recognizing competent leadership. "Lieutenant, what do you need?" It was a simple question with complex implications. Ortiz was offering her expertise and credibility to support Naomi's planning, a gesture that carried significant weight among the watching soldiers. "Terrain analysis and available assets. I want to understand what we're actually dealing with before we start moving people around the mountain." Doc Rockman joined them carrying a medical kit and the kind of alert expression that suggested he'd recognized the serious nature of Hayes' evaluation. "Lieutenant, I'm assuming you'll want medical support positioned for rapid response rather than embedded with the assault element." It was exactly the kind of tactical thinking that separated good medics from great ones. Rockman was anticipating requirements and offering solutions before problems developed. Corporal Park approached with a tablet displaying topographical maps and the nervous energy of someone eager to prove himself. "Ma'am, I've been analyzing the terrain features. There are 3 potential routes to the target area, but only one offers concealment for the approach phase." Naomi studied the information, her engineer's mind automatically calculating angles, distances, and structural advantages. The target area was positioned to observe the base's primary approaches, a tactically sound location that would require creative thinking to neutralize. "What about defensive positions? If we're walking into prepared ground, I want to know what we're facing." "Unknown. Intelligence is limited to position and probable strength." It was the kind of incomplete information that made military operations challenging and military leaders gray-haired. Naomi would have to plan for multiple contingencies while maintaining enough flexibility to adapt as conditions developed. She spent 20 minutes creating a plan that balanced speed with security, using her engineering background to identify terrain features that could be exploited for tactical advantage. Rather than a direct approach that would expose her soldiers to defensive fire, she designed a movement pattern that used natural cover and elevation changes to approach the target area from an unexpected direction. Ortiz, I want your most experienced people on overwatch positions here and here. She indicated points on the map that would provide supporting fire if needed. Rockman, position yourself for rapid casualty evacuation, but stay outside the immediate engagement area. Park, you're with me on the assault element. Each assignment reflected an understanding of individual capabilities and tactical requirements. Naomi was using her soldiers' strengths while protecting them from unnecessary risks. As they moved out across the mountain terrain, Naomi felt the familiar rhythm of competent soldiers working together toward a common objective. But she also sensed something else, the watching presence of Colonel Hayes and her evaluation team, observing every decision and noting every result. The approach phase went smoothly, her soldiers moving with the disciplined quiet that marked professional infantry. But as they neared the target area, Naomi's tactical instincts began registering inconsistencies. The hostile observation post was positioned correctly for intelligence gathering, but the defensive preparations were minimal. Either the enemy was incompetent, or this was a more complex scenario than Hayes had indicated. She made the decision to pause the assault and conduct additional reconnaissance. It was a choice that prioritized soldier safety over mission speed, exactly the kind of leadership decision that revealed character under pressure. Park, take 2 people and scout the flanking routes. Something doesn't feel right about this setup. Park nodded and moved off with practiced stealth. 10 minutes later, he returned with information that confirmed Naomi's suspicions. Lieutenant, there's a secondary position approximately 50 meters beyond the primary target. Looks like they're set up for an ambush if we take the obvious approach. It was exactly the kind of tactical complexity that separated novice planners from experienced leaders. Hayes had created a scenario that punished conventional thinking and rewarded adaptive problem-solving.
Sergeant Ortiz, you will serve as senior non-commissioned officer for the combined unit, with authority to implement new standards for operational readiness and professional development. Ortiz's expression remained carefully neutral, but Naomi could see satisfaction in her eyes. After 20 years of military service, she was finally getting the opportunity to work with leadership that valued competence over politics. The conduct that led to Captain Pike's injury, Hayes said, addressing the elephant in the room directly, will be noted in Lieutenant Vega's record as defensive action taken under extenuating circumstances. No formal disciplinary action will be pursued. It was as close to official vindication as military bureaucracy allowed. Hayes was acknowledging that Naomi's response had been justified while maintaining the fiction that attacking superior officers remained unacceptable. However, Hayes added, her voice taking on the steel that marked career military officers discussing non-negotiable principles, future conduct will be held to the highest standards of military professionalism, leadership through competence, not confrontation. The message was clear. Naomi was being given a second chance, but it came with expectations that would be rigorously enforced. Hayes moved back to her desk and picked up a folder that Naomi recognized as containing personnel evaluations and unit assessments. Facility Kestrel will be restructured as a legitimate training facility for advanced tactical operations, Hayes announced. The mission will change from warehousing problem personnel to developing competent leaders. Resources will be allocated accordingly, and personnel assignments will reflect operational requirements rather than disciplinary convenience. It was transformation on an institutional level, recognition that the problems at Kestrel went deeper than individual personality conflicts and required systematic reform. Corporal Park, you will be recommended for advanced leadership training with assignment to the facility's new tactical development program. Park's face lit up with the kind of joy that marked young soldiers seeing their careers take unexpected positive turns. After months of watching competence punished and mediocrity rewarded, he was seeing merit recognized and potential developed. Doc Rahman, your medical protocols and unit integration have been exemplary. You will be retained as senior medical specialist with expanded responsibilities for training and development. Raman's grin was infectious. Thank you, ma'am. Happy to serve wherever needed. As the formal briefing concluded and personnel began filing out, Hayes gestured for Naomi to remain. Lieutenant, a word. When they were alone, Hayes's professional demeanor relaxed slightly, revealing the experienced officer behind the command presence. What happened here was unusual, not unprecedented, but unusual. You were placed in an impossible situation by inadequate leadership, and you responded with courage that bordered on recklessness. Naomi remained silent, understanding that Hayes was working towards something important. The question going forward is whether you can channel that courage into leadership that builds rather than breaks, whether you can transform this unit through competence rather than confrontation. Ma'am, I believe good soldiers deserve good leadership. If I can provide that, I will. Hayes studied her for a long moment. The nickname they're using for you, the wrist breaker, could be a liability or an asset depending on how you handle it. Reputation is a tool, Lieutenant. Use it wisely. As Naomi left the office that symbolized arbitrary authority just days earlier, she realized that everything at Facility Kestrel was about to change. The question was whether she could live up to the expectations that came with being the officer who'd stood up to institutional incompetence and won. Outside, soldiers were gathering in small groups, processing the news of Pike's removal and Hayes's restructuring plans. Their conversations were animated, hopeful in ways that hadn't been possible under Pike's leadership. Sergeant Ortiz approached with the kind of satisfied expression that marked veteran non-commissioned officers seeing justice finally served. So, Lieutenant, ready to find out what this unit can really do when it's led properly? Naomi looked across the training field where Pike had tried to humiliate her, where one decisive moment had changed everything for everyone at Facility Kestrel. Let's find out, Sergeant. 6 weeks later, Facility Kestrel bore little resemblance to the demoralized outpost Pike had commanded. The same buildings occupied the same positions on the mountainside, but everything else had transformed with the efficiency of a military unit finally operating according to its potential. Naomi stood at the edge of the main training field, watching her soldiers execute engineering drills that combined technical precision with tactical realism. What had once been make-work assignments designed to keep troublesome personnel occupied had evolved into sophisticated training that prepared soldiers for actual combat operations. "Contact front," Corporal Park's voice carried across the field as his squad responded to a simulated threat. The movement was fluid, disciplined, and effective, marking the evolution from theoretical knowledge to practical competence. Park had grown into his leadership role with the enthusiasm of someone finally given the opportunity to succeed. His squad respected him not because of his rank, but because of his competence, and that respect translated into the kind of unit cohesion that made the difference between survival and casualties in actual combat.
"Looking good," Sergeant Ortiz said, appearing at Naomi's shoulder with the silent movement that marked experienced non-commissioned officers. "Remember when they could barely manage equipment inventories without screwing something up?" "I remember," Naomi replied. "What I didn't expect was how quickly they'd adapt once given proper leadership and realistic expectations." It was the most important lesson she'd learned during her time at Kestrel, that most soldiers weren't incompetent, they were simply trapped in systems that punished excellence and rewarded mediocrity. Remove those constraints, and human potential could achieve remarkable things. Doc Raman jogged up from the medical station, carrying a field kit and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that marked professionals working at the top of their capabilities. "Lieutenant, the new medical protocols are working better than expected. Response times are down 40%, and the soldiers are actually retaining the first aid training instead of just going through the motions." It was gratifying feedback, but more importantly, it was data that demonstrated measurable improvement in unit capabilities. The kind of metrics that justified Hayes's decision to transform Kestrel from a disciplinary dumping ground into a legitimate training facility. "Any word from Colonel Hayes about the assessment team visit next week?" Naomi asked.
She's bringing some brass from division headquarters. Word is they're considering using our protocols as a model for other facilities. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Facility Kestrel, once the place where careers went to die, was becoming a showcase for innovative training methods and effective leadership development. The wrist-breaking incident that could have destroyed Naomi's career had instead catalyzed changes that were attracting positive attention from senior command. As afternoon faded into evening, Naomi found herself in the same office where Pike had attempted to establish dominance through intimidation and Hayes had demonstrated authority through competence. But now it was her office, her responsibility, her opportunity to prove that leadership earned through respect could accomplish things leadership imposed through fear never could. On her desk was a folder containing transfer requests, not from soldiers trying to escape Kestrel, but from personnel at other facilities requesting assignment to her unit. Word had spread through military networks about the transformation at Facility Kestrel, and competent soldiers wanted to be part of something that actually worked. Among the requests was one that made her smile. A young engineering officer from Fort Bragg, whose personnel file indicated excessive attention to procedural details and tendency to question established practices. The kind of officer who would have been a problem for Pike but would thrive under leadership that valued competence over compliance. A knock at her door interrupted her review of the files. Corporal Park entered with the kind of nervous energy that marked soldiers about to share important news. "Lieutenant, I wanted to let you know I got accepted for advanced leadership training. Assignment starts next month." It was exactly the kind of career development that should happen when competent soldiers were given opportunities to grow. Park had earned his advancement through demonstrated ability rather than political connections. "Congratulations, Corporal, you've earned it." "Thank you, ma'am." "And, Lieutenant, what happened here with Captain Pike and everything, the story's getting around. People are calling you the wrist breaker, but they mean it with respect, like someone who stands up for what's right even when it's dangerous." Park paused, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted you to know that what you did, standing up to Pike, taking that risk, it mattered. Not just for you, but for all of us. You showed us that competence and courage can beat politics and intimidation." After Park left, Naomi reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since arriving at Facility Kestrel. She'd come here as a problem officer being warehoused away from important assignments. Now she was commanding a unit that was becoming a model for military training effectiveness. The wrist-breaking incident had become legend, but not in the way Pike had intended. Instead of a cautionary tale about the consequences of challenging authority, it had become a story about the power of principled resistance to institutional injustice. Soldiers throughout the command structure were retelling the story, each version emphasizing different aspects, but all carrying the same core message: competence and courage could triumph over incompetence and corruption, but only if someone was willing to take the risk of standing up for what was right. As she prepared to leave the office, she noticed a small package on her desk that hadn't been there earlier. Inside was a patch designed by Doc Rahman featuring crossed engineering tools and the words "Earned, not given," embroidered in gold thread. Attached was a note: "For the officer who taught us that real authority comes from respect, not fear. From the soldiers of Facility Kestrel." It was signed by every member of the unit. That evening, as Naomi walked across the training field where Pike had attempted to humiliate her and where she'd instead found the courage to fight back, she realized that some victories extended far beyond the moment of their achievement. The wrist-breaking incident had lasted seconds, but its consequences were still reverberating through Facility Kestrel and beyond. Young officers were learning that competence could triumph over politics. Experienced soldiers were rediscovering the satisfaction of serving under effective leadership. And somewhere in military bureaucracy, administrators were documenting training protocols and leadership methods that would influence how soldiers were developed for years to come.
In the distance, the mountain peaks caught the last light of sunset, their granite faces unchanged by human ambition and conflict. But in the valley below, Facility Kestrel hummed with the energy of an organization that had rediscovered its purpose and potential. Naomi smiled as she headed toward her quarters, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove that leadership earned through respect could accomplish extraordinary things. The wristbreaker had become something more important than her nickname. It had become her legacy. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It really helps our team grow.